In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to quickly and easily create grids within Illustrator. If you recall, grid-based design kind of originated with the Swiss design movement, the idea of creating structure, because there wasn't a lot of structure in graphic design before that. So creating this structure really helps to align text and objects and to guide where the audience is looking. All right. So I have an 11 by 17 inch document in Illustrator. You can see the red line on the outside, that is my bleed. I have a 1/8 inch bleed, that's 0.125 inches all the way around. Since this was a default document, you notice that there are these default swatches that come with it. Well, you should know that as a good designer and somebody who's creative, I want you to get rid of those default swatches, right? Anybody who doesn't know what they're doing, beginner Illustrator, they're just going to use those not realizing that there's 16 million plus colors. So I don't want you to be burdened by the limitation of the default swatches. So with your swatches panel active, come up here to the options, select all unused, right? So they're all selected, and hit delete swatch and say yes. That's going to leave you with white and black, which is the default. That way, as good designers, you know to choose and create your own colors and not rely on the default swatches. Alright, so back to grid design. Just a little tangent, but now back to grid design. So let's create a grid nice and easily. We are going to need the rectangle tool. Alright, so I got the rectangle tool over there. Since our artboard's white, I want to make the rectangle black just so we can see it. And I want to turn the stroke off. Alright, so red line, stroke off, black fill. Now, I just want to click. I don't want to click and drag with the rectangle tool active. I just want to click, and it's going to open up a rectangle dialog box. And this document is 11 by 17 inches. So I want my rectangle to be 11 by 17. I'm going to click OK. By default, it probably will not line it up center. I want to take my selection tool, and with the rectangle selected, I want to come up to the options bar up here and make sure under the alignment window or alignment option here we have align to board selected. Then we want to horizontal align center and vertical align center, and that's going to move it perfectly centered on our 11 by 17 inch artboard. Next, we want to use the magic of Illustrator to divide this rectangle up into a grid. So we have the rectangle selected. It is known as a path and an object, right? So we're going up to object in our menu, and then we're going to come down to path, and we want this option right here which says split into grid. So we're going to split this rectangle into a grid. Another dialog box opens. In this instance, or any dialog box that opens that has a preview option, I say turn it on so you can see what you're doing before you commit to any changes. We also want to add guides because we're going to use guides for our grid, so add guides. Now, how many columns and how many rows? So if you recall, there's the rule of thirds. That's one way to do it, right? You could do rule of thirds. Sometimes I like to have more columns than that. I almost always use either multiples of 3 for rule of thirds, or I really like to do odd based columns, so 3, 5, 7, something like that. That allows us to play with asymmetrical balance, which is really good at creating visual interest. So in this design, or in this grid, I'm going to go with 5 columns, all right? 5 columns. You can see them over here, little blue lines. Also, I want to create a gutter, right? So gutter, you can think of gutter like a margin. So if we were to put text side by side, like columns 1 and 2 side by side with column 3 and 4, and there was no gutter, the text would butt up right next to each other, make it really hard to read because there wouldn't be margin. So I'm going to do 0.1 gutter, and you can see that this white line there separates, right? You can experiment, you can do 0.2, something that looks good. As far as rows, some grid designers just worry about the columns. You could think rule of thirds and come in and add a rule of third like that, which I'm going to do, right? Rule of third. As far as rows, so I have 3 Again, same gutter, click OK. Now, over here on our layer, if we drill down, we open this up, our top option, which is this one, it's group, it's a little cut off, but that's our guidelines. Everything else here, it kind of cut that rectangle into little tiny rectangles. So if I take my direct selection tool, I can select these, and these are shapes, and there's cool things you can do with that. I use this as a starter, right? And you can come in and just kind of proof of concept. You can see how I can come in and those are actual shapes. However, for grid-based design, we're not going to worry about that. We just want the guides. So I'm going to lock the guides, have everything else unlocked so that if I hit Command A, which is select all, Command A, it's going to select all of those little shapes, and then I can hit the delete key, get rid of them, but it keeps our guidelines and our margins is what I want. I want to lock that whole layer, and working smart, I know to change that to something that makes sense. So instead of layer 1, I'm going to call that layer grid. Now, do you have to do 5 and 3? No, right? That's just my example for this 11 by 17 inch poster. Based on the design you're working on, experiment with different numbers of grids. Another cool feature, right, is if you come under View and come all the way down here, you can see Show Grid, and Illustrator has its built-in kind of grids, right? They're usually 1-inch squares, but you can see how that many lines gets distracting. That's why I showed you this technique. But if you need to be more precise, you can turn that on under View Grid.